Hey there, it's Rahul Vanamali here, and today I'm back with a different kind of video. I think it's my first time speaking on this channel, so that's kind of neat. Anyway, I'm really excited to present my new Ultimate Electronic Drum Kit setup. I've been in the process of putting this together for the last few months, and since it's not exactly a conventional e-kit setup, I thought it would be fun to document the process and share it here. Just a quick note to let you know how this video is going to go. First off, I'm going to talk a little bit about why exactly I went this route instead of buying an electronic drum kit from Roland, Yamaha, or Alesis, and how that informed my choices for the specific components that I used. Then I'll move on to the individual components of the kit. This isn't a sponsored video, although if any of those companies want to sponsor me, I wouldn't complain. But I'll make sure I do drop links for all these in the description below if anyone wants to check them out. For the last few years, I've been doing some recording on an electronic kit I owned, an Alesis Nitro Mesh, which you might have seen in some of my earlier videos. And as I moved back home, I wanted to upgrade to a kit that was more sensitive and accurate in capturing my playing, as well as one that was a more realistic simulation of practicing on an acoustic drum set. With the high volume levels meaning that acoustic kits were out of the picture, I turned to acoustic-to-electric, or A to E conversions, to see whether I could find a setup that worked for me. Additionally, I've recently taken an interest in experimenting with the integration of electronics into drum kit setups, and I figured that if I went the custom route by sourcing triggers separately, as with Sunhouse's sensory percussion sensors, which you'll see later, it would provide me with more versatility and flexibility with the kinds of sounds I could use and the methods in which I could produce them. And if I needed to take my kit to a gig in a pinch, I'd have the option to use my electronic setup or throw on some acoustic heads and use it like a regular kit. The final big point was the fact that I've been primarily using my electronic kit to trigger samples on my computer. I've been using a lot of GetGood drums. And while modules have their benefits, I wasn't too keen on spending a lot of money on a module which I'd effectively use only as an interface. Hence the eDRUMin as an alternative, which I'll also discuss later. Anyway, that's enough about that. Time to get to the kit. Here are the fundamental components that I started off with, based off an acoustic kit. First off, a drum mat, which you'd need regardless, because you don't want to be scratching your floor, or worse, having your bass drum slide away from you as you play. And then a shell pack. I'm using the Pearl Export EXA in the limited edition Nimbus Midnight Finish. This is essentially a reskin of the standard Pearl Export, which is one of the best-selling drum kits of all time. This is a 5-piece kit, but because I only have sensors for the snare and 2 toms, I dropped a rack tom. I'm using an old Speed Cobra double pedal, upgraded with the new Tama ACOUSTIC Cobra beaters, and the hardware is from Pearl's 930 series. Don't underestimate the value of good hardware. I'm also using the Rock and Sock Nitro Throne because a hydraulic lift is very nice. Now that the basic components of the kit are done, it's time to move on to the first step of the A to E conversion, and that's going to be mesh heads. There we go. All the drums will have triggers on them, so using mesh heads massively cuts down on sound levels and provides a much more apartment-friendly sound. There's many different offerings from a variety of companies, but I've gone with the new DB0 series from Evans. They're the quietest heads the company makes, and they seem to be at least partially targeted towards electronic setups, which is just what I'm looking for. An important accessory to remember for the bass drum is a patch. It's always a good idea to have one on any bass drum to protect the head, but it's all the more important on mesh heads, since the beater really digs into the head. Adding a patch is a great way to extend the longevity of the head with everyday use. I've gone with the Remo Falam Slam. I also added in rubber rim guards. There are companies like Pintec that make these for drums, but I wasn't able to find a store near me that sold them, so I just bought edge guards for car doors, which fit my drum rims perfectly. I did this primarily to reduce the volume of rim shots, as well as to protect my sticks. I initially added them just around the lower half of each drum, but because of the way my sensors work, more on that later, I realized I'd be using a lot more of the rims than I initially thought, so I ended up adding them all around the drum. Next up, drum triggers. A friend of mine introduced me to V1 of sensory percussion just over a year ago, and I was really impressed with them. For anyone not familiar, these sensors are incredibly advanced and can provide up to 10 zones per drum, and they come with an in-depth accompanying software to program them. For example, parameters such as speed, velocity, and even location on the drum can be used to control different aspects of the software. When Sensory Percussion launched version 2 in December, I knew this was the right choice for me, so I went ahead with the bundle. The bundle comes with 3 sensors and an interface to plug them into, and the interface can handle up to 7 sensors at a time. I didn't use one on the bass drum though, as I used my sensors on the snare drum, a rack tom, and the floor tom. I used a different trigger on the bass drum, which I'll get to soon. I won't go into too much sensory specific setup detail just yet, as I do want to keep this as a more general drum set video. And apart from this step, the process should be very similar with other triggers too. Although if there's any interest or questions, I'll consider making another video to answer those. If I wasn't using a module, I needed some kind of interface between my computer and my bass drum and cymbal triggers. Enter eDRUMin. The eDRUMin is a device by the company Audiofront that acts as an interface between drum pads and a computer, and it can be used either instead of or in conjunction with an eDrum module. Since I always use my drum kit to trigger sample libraries on my computer, I didn't feel like I needed an advanced eDrum module, so I opted for the eDRUMin, which was quite a bit cheaper. As my Evans portal, the interface, was handling the sensory percussion pads, I opted for the smaller eDRUMin 4 for my cymbals and my bass drum triggers. This has 4 sensor inputs, a pedal input, USB and MIDI out, and a power supply in case you want to use it without connecting it to a computer. While the eDRUMin doesn't have any sounds of its own, or any onboard controls like a module does, it has its own software that can be used to control individual pad sensitivity, velocity curves, and so on right from a computer. The eDRUMin tutorials on the website do a great job of explaining how to set up different pads. All my triggers worked right out of the box. It was plug and play. I wasn't entirely sure if I'd have enough inputs for all my cymbals, so I ended up getting a couple of splitters. I got the Hosa YPP111 and the YPP117. The YPP111 is a mono Y cable that allows me to put 2 triggers on my 2 bass drum pedals and connect them to the same input. The YPP117 is a breakout cable that allows me to split one input into a mono input and a pad or cymbal input, which could even support dual zone sensing. The mono input is what I split with the Y cable to put 2 bass drum triggers into the same input. Speaking of pedal triggers, it's time to get to Footblaster. I'd heard great things about these triggers, so I decided to try them out. The idea of having a pedal-mounted trigger rather than a head-mounted one intrigued me, especially since the possibility of double triggering seems lower with these. It took me a little while to figure out the best position for them, but my recommendation would be to find the part of the pedal baseboard that's widest and can fit most of the trigger on, and then bend the metal plate up, which I didn't realize you could do at first, to make contact with the bottom of the pedal board when the beater touches the head. Pretty simple. As for cymbals, I wanted to try something different from rubber, so I explored metal electronic cymbals and came across Jobeky's electronic offerings. Thanks, Nolly. So I decided to get 14-inch hats. I got the double hats because I wanted the feel of 2 hi-hat cymbals, and an 18-inch triple zone ride. These are in the black stealth color, which I thought matched my kit's aesthetic really well. These cymbals are really well built and they're extremely responsive. In addition to that, they feel a little more realistic than rubber cymbals. They were also plug and play with the eDRUMin. I should mention, for these purposes, pretty much any electronic cymbal should work, as the eDRUMin supports cymbals from all the major manufacturers, and Jobeky works with Roland settings, I believe. As mentioned earlier, I won't be going too far into specifics for the individual setups for my GetGood drums routing, my sensory percussion setup, or my eDRUMin settings. I think they're a little outside the scope of this video, and there are a lot of good tutorials out there, some of which I'll link below. But I'm happy to answer any questions in the comments, and I'll also consider making a follow-up video with additional clarifications if there's interest. Okay, next I'm going to talk about software. I'm going to go through each piece of software I use and check all the settings in each of them. So first up, in Logic, I have my GetGood drums library running in Kontakt 7. I have done some routing here, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'll link a video in the description from GetGood drums that talks about how to route drums in Logic. So I have my drum map here. All the sounds that I use are mapped to specific notes. So I've got the kick on C0, the snare on D0, and just a couple of other things to pay attention to. I've got my MIDI channels set to Omni to ensure that I get input from all my input sources. And my sample rate is set to 44.1, which is the same sample rate that my sensory percussion software is running at, just to avoid any glitches. The next piece of software I'm going to talk about is the eDRUMin software, which can be downloaded from the eDRUMin website. This allows you to control various parameters for each input, like velocity, sensitivity, and note output. Each input gives you the option to select a pad type and a part of the kit. I have 4 inputs here, plus a pedal input. My first input is the bass drum. I chose the trigger bar because that pad type seemed closest to what I'm using. My second input is a ride cymbal, and I chose a Roland 3-zone cymbal. And when you choose the 3-zone cymbal, it automatically turns the following input into the bell. So my third input is the bell for my second input, which is the ride. My fourth input is a hi-hat, which I chose to be a dual zone cymbal. And then finally, I have my pedal here. Although the default is a superior drummer map, you can create your own map. You can create global maps for the entire drum kit, as well as individual maps for each pad or cymbal. I created a GetGood drums map based on my mapping in Kontakt, and set the note output accordingly. So when I play any of these notes, you should hear the right sound being triggered in Kontakt. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to turn off my microphone and play these sounds. So before I move on, I'm going to talk about hi-hat calibration really quick, because I know that's a common issue for electronic drum kit setups. And I had this issue as well until I watched a couple of YouTube videos and did a little bit of experimenting and figured out something that works for me. So with GetGood drums, I'm going to show you how to calibrate your hi-hat. I'm going to reset all my mappings here, just so I can start from the beginning. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to hi-hat CC, and while the hi-hat's open, I'm going to hit it once on the edge and once on the bow. And now that that's done, I'm going to hit Learn CC and press the pedal. And now I'm going to click Invert, so it sets the pedal settings the right way. So now you should hear and the last thing I'm going to do is go to my pedal and record that. So I'm just going to hit the pedal once. So now I'm going to play through the settings on the hi-hat, and you should hear all the sounds you need. I'm going to turn off my mic and go. The last thing I need to do before going to sensory percussion is talk a little bit about my audio routing. Now, if you're not using sensory percussion sensors, then you probably don't need this because the eDRUMin will send MIDI seamlessly to your DAW. But with Sensory Percussion V1, there was a plugin that you could use to use the software within your DAW. And while the compatibility is coming to Sensory Percussion V2, it's not there yet, which means in the meantime, to record yourself, you're going to need a virtual input. Loopback is a very strongly recommended software. I personally use Blackhole and it works really well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my audio MIDI setup and create a new multi-output. And I'm going to select Blackhole, my headphones, and my portal, which is the Sunhouse interface. And then I'm going to go to Window and Show MIDI Studio. And here, what you need to do is click on IAC driver and make sure the device is online and add as many buses as you need. I just need one, so I created one, made sure it was online, and applied it. There we go. The next thing you're going to do is go into Logic, into Settings and Audio, and make sure your input device is set to Blackhole. Just make sure you go through these steps, and I'll talk about the rest of the routing when I get to the sensory percussion software, which is next. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is the Sensory Percussion V2 software. I'm going to try not to go over stuff that's in the manual and talk about just how I set it up. I've got my inputs in here and my outputs over there. The first thing I'm going to do is go to my settings. My input device is my Evans portal, which is the sensory percussion interface. My output device is my drums routing. which consists of the Evans portal, so I can plug in headphones there if I want. But it also includes my external headphones, which is what I'm using right now, as well as Black Hole, which is my virtual input. The next thing I'm going to do is go to my outputs and create a MIDI output. This is what I did here. The output device is IAC driver bus 1, and this is what allows Kontakt to recognize the incoming MIDI. I left the channel as incoming, and I'm using MIDI channel 1 over here. I'm going to go to the edit page, and there's two parts to this. There are the MIDI note generators, which is what I'm using to control sounds in Kontakt in GetGood drums, and then there are the sounds within Sensory Percussion themselves. I've muted those sounds for now just to show you how the MIDI note generator works. So if I open the first one, I've got the snare drum there. I've chosen the center of the pad will send the D0 signal, which corresponds to the snare drum in Kontakt in GetGood drums. So now if I play my snare drum, it sends a MIDI signal, and you should hear this. And you'll also be able to see that in the MIDI output, the note on or off blinks, showing that there's a signal passing through. I've got the same thing set up for my rack tom and my floor tom. To go a little in depth into what I've done with the sensory sounds, let's look at tom 1 because the snare doesn't have anything mapped onto it. If I open tom 1, there's a sequencer there, and it's mapped onto the edge of the drum, as you can see. And this sequencer cycles between 4 chords that I chose. And if you look at each chord, there's a sequencer within each chord that changes the inversion of the chord. These are presets that I used, but you can customize them to your liking. And so now if I hit the edge of the drum, it's going to cycle between these 4 chords, and each time the chord is going to be in a different inversion. Let's try that. And for the second tom, the floor tom, I set a melody. I set it to play on the center and the edge, and it's a 26 note long melody. But I did something interesting with the velocity curve. I moved it to the right a bit so that the sound doesn't trigger unless I play past a certain velocity, which means low notes like ghost notes on the floor tom are not going to trigger it, which is what I was aiming for. So now, if I unmute the floor tom, you should hear the floor tom played at low volumes, and then when it goes higher, you'll hear the melody join in. There's a lot that you can do with the software, and I'm only just starting to get the hang of it. But from what I've seen so far, I'm really excited to explore a lot more. The last thing I'm going to show you is this project in Logic. It's what I just recorded during the introduction. So I've got these tracks that are all my GetGood drums routing, and this was recorded through MIDI sent from Sensory Percussion. And the audio here is a stereo track that was recorded through Sensory Percussion because my input is Black Hole. So if I play these together, you should hear what I was playing during the introduction. Anyway, that's going to be it for my ultimate electronic drum kit setup video. I hope you found it interesting, and feel free to leave any questions in the comments below. And feel free to also link your own drum kit setups. I'd love to see more drum gear. And I'll catch you in the next one.